At 6:12 that morning, she woke to what sounded like thunder. But the sky above the frozen town was completely clear. When she pulled back the curtain, hundreds of motorcycles were lined outside her home. At the front stood the same Hell's Angel she had found half frozen the night before. She had given him the last food in her kitchen, even though it meant her own son would have no breakfast. Across the road stood a man carrying the documents that could take everything she owned by 9 o'clock. Before sunrise, one bowl of stew would become the most valuable meal ever served. Before we go back to where this began, tell us where you're watching from. We did love to hear from you. At 6:12 that morning, Mara Bellamy woke to thunder. Not the rolling thunder of a winter storm. This sound was deeper, harder. It shook the glass and sent a tremor through the floor. She pulled the curtain aside. Motorcycles filled the road outside Bellamy's last stop. There were dozens at first glance, then hundreds. They stretched beyond the diner, past the frozen gas station, and around the bend where the highway disappeared beneath falling snow. Black jackets stood shoulder to shoulder. Snow gathered across helmets, handlebars, and glowing headlights. No one spoke. No one moved toward the building. Mara's hand tightened around the curtain. At the bottom of her apartment steps stood Silas Creed, the freezing stranger she had allowed inside the night before. His leather vest was dark with melted snow. In one hand, he held the empty food container from her kitchen. He looked up at her window as though waiting for her to wake. Across the road, a black luxury SUV stopped. Wade Barlow stepped out carrying a brown document folder beneath one arm. He paused when he saw the motorcycles, then straightened his coat, glanced at his watch, and stared toward Mara's door. It was just after 6. The deadline was 9. Less than 3 hours remained before Wade could take something Mara had spent years protecting. Then Silas slowly raised one hand. 500 engines fell silent at once. The sudden quiet was more frightening than the noise. Mara reached for the lock, unsure whether the men outside had come to save her, punish someone, or collect a debt she did not understand. Behind Silas, one motorcycle backfired. The sharp crack became the snap of a diner stove igniting. 12 hours earlier, Mara believed the worst thing waiting for her was an empty kitchen alone. As darkness settled over Briar Ridge, Bellamy's last stop looked like somewhere refusing to admit it was already closed. The red open sign flickered, losing one letter. Snow pressed against the glass. Wind struck the building in hollow bursts, rattling the frames and making the diner seem to breathe. Mara Bellamy wiped down a table unused since early afternoon. Only 2 customers had entered during the last 3 hours. One ordered coffee and waited for the roads to worsen. The other bought soup, left $3 beneath his cup, and apologized for not having more. Their cups sat near the sink. Mara carried them into the kitchen and opened it. 2 eggs, half an onion, a little butter, 1 bowl of beef stew from the night before. Beyond that, the shelves held more cold air than food. She closed the door gently. From beneath the floor came 3 metallic knocks. The heating system had started making that sound 2 days earlier. First once an hour, then every 20 minutes. Now it happened often enough that she had begun counting the seconds between each strike. At the register, Mara removed the cash tray and counted what remained. 20, 30, 35, $38. She counted it again, flattening each bill against the counter before returning it to the tray. The total did not change. Beside the register lay several unpaid supplier invoices, their corners worn from being handled and put back. Beneath them was a red utility notice warning that service could be disconnected if the overdue balance remained unpaid. Mara read the first line, though she already knew every word. Then a floorboard creaked above her. Orrin was still upstairs, but he would come down soon. She folded the red notice and pushed it beneath the counter before he could see it. 11-year-old boys were not supposed to understand shut-off dates, late fees, or how quickly security could disappear. The last envelope was heavier. Wade Barlow's name was printed across the top. For months, Wade had been purchasing the properties surrounding the diner, the abandoned repair shop, the warehouse lot, two aging houses near the highway. He called it redevelopment, a commercial project that would bring stores, traffic, and money into Briar Ridge. But every parcel on his map connected except one. Bellamy's last stop. Mara opened his final offer and read the deadline again. 9 o'clock the next morning. Accept by then, or the offer disappeared. Wade had not explained everything. He rarely did. He preferred short sentences, polished shoes, and the certainty of a man who believed time always worked for him. The apartment above the diner had belonged to Mara's father. So had the kitchen, the counter, the cracked booths, and the stubborn sign in the window. After her husband died, the building became more than an inheritance. It became the one stable thing she could still give Oren. A room that was theirs, a door no landlord could close, a place carrying the Bellamy name. Above the kitchen pass-through hung her father's old wooden sign. Nobody leaves hungry. The words had faded at the edges, but Mara remembered him painting them by hand. She looked at the sign, then at the empty refrigerator, the dark shelves, and the $38 in the register. Another metallic knock sounded beneath the floor. This time, Mara did not count the seconds. A soft creak came from the staircase. Oren appeared wearing an oversized gray sweater that had once belonged to his father. The sleeves covered most of his hands, and his hair was flattened on one side from sleep. He looked toward the empty booths before looking at Mara. "Did anybody order the meatloaf special?" Mara turned back to the counter before he could read her face. "Not tonight," she said. "The storm kept people home." It was not exactly a lie. Snow had kept customers away. It had simply not been the only reason the diner was empty. Oren nodded, as though that explanation was enough. Mara carried the final bowl of beef stew from the refrigerator and spooned it into a plastic container. She placed 2 pieces of cornbread beside it, wrapping each one carefully in paper. That was everything. The stew was supposed to be their dinner. 1 piece of cornbread would go with it. The other was meant for Oren's breakfast before school, assuming the roads opened by morning. He watched her close the container. "What are we eating tomorrow?" Mara pressed the lid firmly into place. Tomorrow has a way of bringing something with it. Oren looked at the nearly empty shelves behind her. He did not believe her. Not completely. But children sometimes protect their parents by pretending they are convinced. "Okay," he said quietly. Mara placed the container inside a worn canvas bag and reached for their coats. Her phone began to ring. Wade Barlow. She considered letting it stop, but Oren had already seen the name. Mara answered. Wade's voice was calm, almost considerate. "I wanted to make sure you understood the offer expires at 9 tomorrow morning." "I understand. I'm trying to give you a clean way out, Mara. With the repairs, the heating problems, and everything else, accepting is your only responsible choice." Mara glanced at Oren. He was pretending to study the snow outside, but she knew he was listening. "This is not a conversation I'm having in front of my son." Wade paused. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. His certainty carried its own pressure. "Sentiment is expensive, Mara. Eventually, everyone sells." She ended the call without answering. For a few seconds, she stood with the phone still pressed against her ear. Oren did not ask what Wade wanted. Mara did not tell him that by 9 the next morning, the choice might no longer feel like hers. She lifted the canvas bag and forced a smile. "Before we go any further, consider what you would have done in Mara's position. Would you protect the place your family built, or take the money before the choice disappeared? Tell us below. But remember your answer, because it may change before sunrise." Mara switched off the diner lights and stepped into the storm with Oren close beside her. The apartment stairs were only a short walk away, but the wind made the distance feel longer. Snow swept across the parking lot in thin white sheets, covering their footprints almost as quickly as they made them. Oren pulled the sleeves of his sweater over his hands. Then he stopped. "Mom?" Something dark rested beside the road. At first, Mara thought it was a fallen branch buried in the snow. Then she saw the motorcycle. It had slid sideways into a snowbank, its rear wheel half covered, and its handlebars turned at an unnatural angle. A man sat beside it. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a leather vest soaked nearly black by melting snow. His gloves looked stiff with ice. Along one exposed knuckle, a narrow line of blood had frozen against his skin. He raised his head slowly. That was when Mara saw the patch across his vest. Oren moved behind her without being told. The stranger noticed. He kept both hands where they could see them. "Fuel line failed," he said. His words dragged slightly, as though his mouth could no longer form them properly. "Lost traction after that." He nodded toward the motorcycle. "My phone's dead. Station's miles from here." He did not ask for shelter. He did not move toward Mara or the stairs. He only looked at the diner. "Does that place have a telephone?" "It's closed," Mara answered. The man gave a small nod, accepting the answer. A black ribbon had been tied around one of the motorcycle mirrors. It snapped weakly in the wind. The damaged saddlebag had opened during the fall, revealing the corner of a folded triangular flag inside. Mara looked away before he noticed. The stranger placed one hand against the motorcycle and tried to stand. His knees buckled. He caught himself, but only barely. His balance was poor. His pale fingertips trembled uncontrollably, and his entire body shook beneath the wet leather. Mara reached for her phone. Emergency services answered, but the dispatcher warned that several roads were blocked. Help was coming. No one could say when. The sensible choice was to keep Oren back, remain outside, and wait. Mara looked at the patch, then at the frozen blood on the stranger's hand, then at her son standing behind her. Compassion and fear pulled in opposite directions, and the man was getting colder. Mara kept the phone pressed to her ear, even after the dispatcher had finished speaking. Help was coming, but not soon enough. The stranger's shivering had become violent, and each breath left him in a white cloud. He tried to steady himself against the motorcycle, but his injured hand slipped on the frozen metal. Mara turned to Oren. "Go upstairs. Lock the bedroom door behind you." Oren stared at her. "No, Oren, I'm not leaving you out here with him." The stranger heard every word. He lowered his eyes, then forced himself upright. "You don't owe me the trouble." He took one step toward the road. His boot dragged through the snow, then another. The third nearly brought him to his knees. Mara watched him struggle away from the only warm building for miles. She looked at Oren, at the patch on the stranger's back, and at the diner keys in her hand. For one long moment, fear made the decision seem obvious. Then she remembered her father standing beside the old diner furnace, during winters just like this one. He had said the same thing whenever someone came in looking half frozen and ashamed to ask for help. Cold doesn't care whether a man is good or bad. Mara closed her hand around the keys. "Wait." The stranger stopped. She crossed the parking lot and stood in front of the diner door. Snow gathered in her hair as she placed the key into the lock. For 10 seconds, she did not turn it. 10 seconds to consider Oren's safety. 10 seconds to imagine every warning Wade would give her. 10 seconds to decide whether fear had the right to speak louder than compassion. Then the lock opened. Warm air, faint but real, moved through the doorway. The stranger stepped inside slowly. He did not move toward Mara. He did not look around for anything valuable. He stopped beneath the wooden sign above the kitchen opening. "Nobody leaves hungry." Something in his expression changed. He removed his gloves and placed them on the counter where Mara could see them. Then he kept his hands open at his sides, as if to show that he understood exactly why she was afraid. Mara handed him 2 towels and pointed toward a chair near the kitchen heater. "Sit before you fall." He obeyed. Oren remained near the doorway. "Mom?" At the sound of the name Bellamy, the stranger looked up sharply. The reaction lasted only a second, but Mara noticed it. She said nothing. He wrapped one towel around his shoulders and held the other over his damaged hand. Then, finally, he spoke. "Silas Creed." Mara nodded. but did not offer her hand. Relief had entered the room. Trust had not. And the consequence of opening that door would not become visible until morning. Mara carried the plastic container into the kitchen and removed the lid. The smell of beef, onions, and pepper spread through the room as the stew warmed over a low flame. Silas looked toward the stove, then away. "I'm not hungry," his stomach answered before Mara could. The sound was quiet, but in the stillness of the diner, all three of them heard it. Oren glanced at him. Silas lowered his eyes. Mara said nothing. She took 3 bowls from the shelf and began dividing the stew. The largest portion went to Oren. A little less went into the bowl she placed in front of Silas. What remained barely covered the bottom of her own. Silas watched every spoonful. Mara set 2 pieces of cornbread on the counter. One went to Oren. The other she placed beside Silas. She sat across from them with no bread at all. For several seconds, no one ate. Then Silas picked up his cornbread, broke it cleanly in half, and placed 1 piece beside Mara's bowl. She looked at him. "You need it more than I do." Silas shook his head. "Not all of it." Mara accepted the bread without argument. Oren took 1 cautious bite of stew, watching Silas over the edge of his bowl. Finally, he asked the question Mara had been avoiding. "Are you dangerous?" Mara's spoon stopped. Silas did not appear offended. He rested both hands on the counter where Oren could see them. "I have been," he said. "That isn't the same as wanting to be." Oren considered the answer. "What happened to your motorcycle?" Silas looked toward the dark window. "I was coming back from my brother's funeral." The room became quieter. He explained that his younger brother had spent years repairing military vehicles before returning home to work as a mechanic. The triangular flag in the saddlebag had been presented to the family that afternoon. The black ribbon tied to the mirror was for him. Silas did not say how his brother died. Mara did not ask. For a while, only spoons touched bowls. The patch on Silas's vest no longer seemed like the first thing in the room. Grief had taken its place. Silas ate slowly, as though he had forgotten what warm food tasted like. Mara saw his shoulders loosen for the first time since he entered. Then his attention shifted to the counter. A corner of the red property notice remained visible beneath the sugar container. Wade Barlow's name could still be read across the top. Silas's expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. "How do you know Wade Barlow?" Mara reached across the counter and pushed the notice out of sight. "That is none of your concern." Silas held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. He did not ask again, but he knew Wade's name, and Mara could not stop wondering why. The knock struck the diner door hard enough to silence the room. Mara looked toward the glass. Wade Barlow stood outside with snow gathering across the shoulders of his dark coat. A leather document folder rested beneath one arm. She did not move at first. Then he knocked again. Mara unlocked the door but left it only partly open. "What are you doing here?" Wade offered a patient smile. "The roads may be worse by morning. I thought it would be easier to finish this tonight." He lifted the folder slightly. Mara understood immediately. He had not come because he was worried about the storm. He had come because the storm had isolated her. No lawyer, no advisor, no one to tell her what the pages in that folder truly meant. Then Wade noticed the motorcycle in the snow. His eyes moved past Mara and settled on Silas. The patched vest, the wet leather, the blood along his hand. Wade's smile remained, but the warmth disappeared from it. "You have a child upstairs, and you're letting men like this inside?" Oren lowered his spoon. Mara felt the insult before she answered. "He needed help. I'm sure that is what he told you." Silas remained seated near the heater. He did not rise. He did not defend himself. He simply watched Wade with a stillness that made the room feel smaller. Wade stepped inside and placed the agreement on the counter. "My offer expires at 9 tomorrow morning. After that, I cannot guarantee the same amount." Mara did not touch the folder. Wade continued in the same calm voice. "There are repair violations attached to this building. Heating, electrical, structural. Once those become part of the formal valuation, the property may be worth considerably less. He was not shouting. That made it worse. Every sentence pressed against the same fear. Oren, the diner, the apartment, and the possibility that waiting until morning would cost Mara everything. Silas looked from Wade to the agreement. Recognition returned to his face. Mara saw it. Wade saw only the patch. I suggest you think about the kind of environment you are creating for your son. Mara opened the door fully. Leave. For the first time, Wade's expression tightened. Then the polite smile returned. 9 o'clock. He stepped outside. Before entering his SUV, he stopped beside Silas's damaged motorcycle, removed his phone, and photographed it. Mara watched through the window, humiliation hardening into anger. Why Wade wanted the photograph, she could not understand. Why Silas knew his name remained another question. If you believe no one should use fear and financial pressure to take a struggling family's future, tap the like button. Wade was counting on Mara, believing she had no one beside her. The SUV disappeared into the snow. Silas looked at the folder on the counter. Let me see the paperwork. Mara placed one hand over the folder before Silas could reach it. No. Silas leaned back slightly. I'm not asking to take it. It is still none of your business. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Oren remained at the counter, listening without pretending otherwise. Silas looked toward the dark window where Wade's SUV had disappeared. I worked commercial transport for almost 20 years, he said. Freight contracts, warehouses, independent shops. I watched men lose businesses because someone put a deadline in front of them and made panic look like a decision. Mara kept her hand on the folder. You said you were a mechanic. My brother was a mechanic. I moved cargo. He nodded toward the papers. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to tell you I can solve whatever is in there, but I know what pressure looks like. That word stayed in the room. Pressure, not failure, not irresponsibility, not the weakness Wade kept trying to make her feel. Mara slowly removed her hand. She opened the folder and turned the pages toward Silas. The heating system needs replacing, she said. Not repairing, replacing. Silas glanced toward the floor as another metallic knock sounded beneath them. The estimate was more than I can pay, Mara continued before pride could stop her. Years earlier, her father had borrowed money for repairs and used the building as security. Most of the debt had been paid, but a private lien remained attached to the property. It had passed through several hands and sat unnoticed until Wade purchased it. Now he controlled the amount still owed. He offered to forgive the lien, Mara said, if I transfer the property to him. Silas read the first page, then the second. And what does he pay you? Mara told him. His eyes lifted. Even without knowing every detail of the development plan, he understood the offer was far below what the diner and land could become worth, once Wade controlled the surrounding parcels. He calls it a clean exit, Mara said. What do you call it? She looked toward Oren. The only money anyone is offering. Silas returned to the agreement. The lien had a payment deadline, 9 o'clock the next morning. If Mara could settle the outstanding amount by then, Wade's leverage would weaken. But she had $38 in the register, an overdue utility balance, and a furnace failing beneath her feet. I cannot raise it, she said. Not overnight. The admission seemed to cost more than the debt itself. Silas studied the pages carefully. He did not pretend to understand every clause. He did not make promises or claim Wade had broken a law. After several minutes, he looked up. Can I photograph these? Mara's answer came immediately. No. Silas nodded once. All right. No argument. No pressure. He slid the folder back across the counter. Then he looked around the diner, the empty booths, the narrow kitchen, the stacked plates, and the faded sign above the pass-through. How many people can this place feed in one morning? Mara frowned. What? How many? She looked toward the kitchen. On a good day? Maybe 80? Silas raised his eyes to the old wooden words. Nobody leaves hungry, He stared at them for a long moment. Then he said nothing. The furnace answered Mara with another hollow knock beneath the floor. She set her bowl aside and disappeared through the kitchen doorway, carrying a flashlight. The access panel near the back wall groaned when she pulled it open. Oren watched her kneel beside the failing heater. Then he looked at Silas. The patch across the biker's vest seemed larger now that the room had grown quiet. Oren had been staring at it since the stranger entered, but curiosity had begun replacing fear. "What does it mean?" he asked. Silas followed his gaze. "The patch." Oren nodded. Silas rested his hands around the bowl. "It means I belong to people who chose the same road I did. Does everyone wearing one act like you?" Silas considered the question. "No. Are they worse? Some are. Some are better." He looked down at the worn leather across his chest. "A patch doesn't make every person underneath it identical. It tells you where someone stands. It doesn't tell you everything they've done." Oren glanced toward Mara, but she was still focused on the furnace. "Did you do bad things?" Silas did not soften the answer. "Yes." The word landed without excuse. "I made choices I regret. I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. Sometimes I confused being feared with being respected." Oren absorbed this with the seriousness children sometimes bring to truths adults avoid. "Then why do they still trust you?" Silas rubbed one thumb over a scar near his knuckle. "Because loyalty isn't pretending a man has never been wrong. What is it? Showing up when it costs something." From the kitchen, Mara paused. She could not see Oren's face, but she heard the question that followed. "Would the other bikers show up for you?" Silas looked toward the windows. "Some would cross 3 states." Mara shook her head and returned to the heater. It sounded like biker pride to her, one of those large promises men made because no one would ask them to prove it. Oren seemed less doubtful. He slipped from his stool and hurried upstairs. When he returned, he carried a pair of wool socks. They had belonged to his father and had been folded at the back of a drawer for years. "These are warmer," Oren said. Silas stared at them. "I'm all right. Your feet are wet. I can manage." Oren held the socks out farther. Silas looked at Mara. She had turned from the furnace and was watching. He accepted them with both hands. "Thank you." A few minutes later, Silas pulled them on. The heels stopped beneath his arches, and the tops barely reached his ankles. Oren tried not to laugh. Silas looked down. "Your father had smaller feet." That broke the tension. Oren laughed openly, and even Mara allowed herself a brief smile. Then the room settled again. Silas adjusted the socks carefully, as though they were valuable. Mara saw Oren watching him differently now. Not as a patch, not as a threat, as a cold man who had told the truth and accepted help without taking more than he was offered. She returned to the furnace, remembering what she had told Oren earlier. Tomorrow has a way of bringing something with it. For the first time that night, Silas looked as though he might believe it. The furnace died with a sound like metal tearing beneath the floor. One final knock echoed through the diner. Then the low mechanical hum disappeared. Mara froze. A few seconds later, the vent stopped breathing warm air. She hurried to the access panel and pulled it open while Silas lowered himself beside her. The heat already seemed to be draining from the room. Cold pressed against the windows, slipped beneath the doors, and settled across the floor. Mara aimed the flashlight into the furnace. "Can you fix it?" Silas studied the ignition assembly. He adjusted one connection, checked another, then shook his head. "The igniter has failed." "Can we force it?" "No." His answer was immediate. "If gas keeps feeding without a proper ignition, this place could fill with carbon monoxide. We leave it alone." Mara wanted to argue, but the seriousness in his voice stopped her. They moved into the smaller kitchen, where the walls held what little warmth remained. Mara gathered blankets from upstairs. Oren wrapped one around his shoulders and sat near the stove, while Silas blocked the bottom of the kitchen door with rolled towels. The diner grew colder by the minute. Ice began forming along the lower corners of the windows as the storm intensified outside around the fragile building. Then Mara's phone vibrated. A message from Wade. The photograph he had taken of Silas's motorcycle filled the screen. Beneath it were 8 words. "Sign tonight, and I will forget what I saw." Mara read the message twice. Wade had not accused her of anything. He did not need to. The meaning was clear. If she refused him, he could use the motorcycle, the patch, and the stranger inside her diner to suggest she was operating an unsafe business, or something worse. Silas saw her expression. "What did he send?" Mara handed him the phone. He read the message and passed it back without speaking. That silence broke something in her. "I'm not only afraid of losing this place," she said. Her voice shook harder than her hands. "I'm afraid Oren will think I didn't fight for it." His father helped rebuild this kitchen. He repaired those booths. He painted the sign out front. "This is the last thing we made together, and I'm standing here watching it fall apart." Oren lowered his eyes. Mara pressed one hand against her mouth, but the tears came anyway. Silas waited until she looked at him. "Losing something after fighting for it isn't failure," he said. "Letting a man convince you that you were never worth helping, that is." Subscribe if you believe stories about ordinary people standing against cruelty deserve to be heard. People like Wade succeed when decent people assume someone else will step forward. The room became quiet again. Silas looked toward the property agreement on the counter. "Let me photograph the documents." Mara hesitated. Then she slid the folder toward him. This time she said yes. For nearly an hour, the storm seemed to swallow every signal reaching Briar Ridge. Mara's phone showed nothing. Silas's showed even less. The battery icon had gone dark before he reached the diner, and the old landline behind the counter had not worked since Wade purchased the neighboring utility lot. Then, without warning, one bar appeared. Silas noticed it first. He crossed to the damaged motorcycle outside, opened the saddlebag, and returned with a small emergency battery wrapped in black tape. Snow clung to his shoulders as he connected it to his phone and waited for the screen to come alive. Mara had finally fallen asleep at the kitchen table. Her head rested against one folded arm. The property agreement lay closed beside her, and the red utility notice remained hidden beneath the counter. Oren slept nearby beneath 2 blankets, his father's sweater pulled over his hands. Silas looked at them both before stepping quietly into the dark dining area. He stood beneath the faded wooden sign, "Nobody leaves hungry." The phone screen glowed against the window, reflected faintly beside the snow moving through the motorcycle's headlight outside. Silas dialed a number from memory. Someone answered before the second ring. "I need a contract reviewed." He listened. Before 9. Another pause. His voice remained low, but there was authority in it now. Not the voice of a stranded traveler asking for help. The voice of a man accustomed to being heard when circumstances turn serious. "No, she doesn't want charity." The person on the other end said something that made Silas look back toward Mara. "She needs a way to keep the place, and she needs customers after tonight." He listened again, longer this time. Then he gave another instruction. "Bring cash registers." The words sounded strange even in the empty diner. Silas continued. "Use every road that is still open. No speeding. No blocking intersections." A faint voice answered through the receiver. Silas's expression hardened. "And tell the road captains not to block emergency access. If an ambulance needs the highway, it gets the highway." He lowered his voice further. "Call the independent groups too. Anyone who understands what this is about." He never gave Mara's name. He never described Wade as an enemy. He simply told the truth about a woman who had divided her last meal with a stranger and was being pressured to surrender her home before morning. Behind him, a chair creaked. Oren stood in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in a blanket. He had heard only the final words. Silas turned. For an instant, Oren stared at the large figure near the window, phone in one hand, black patch outlined against the darkness. Silas raised one finger to his lips, not as a warning. Mara was sleeping. Oren looked toward his mother, then nodded. Silas returned to the call. "Start with the nearest chapters," he said. "Then let the others decide for themselves." He ended the call and watched the single bar disappear from the screen. To Mara, he was still one stranded biker. But far beyond the snow-covered road, phones were beginning to ring. In garages, clubhouses, kitchens, and truck stops, riders reached for jackets hanging beside doors. Some recognized Silas's name immediately. Others knew only the message moving from phone to phone. Someone had shown kindness when walking away would have been easier. Mara woke in the hour before dawn with cold pressed against her face. For several seconds, she did not remember where she was. Then she felt the folded property agreement beneath her arm and heard the wind dragging snow against the diner windows. The kitchen had gone almost completely dark. Oren slept nearby beneath 2 blankets. The chair beside the dead furnace was empty. Mara lifted her head. "Silas?" No answer came from the dining room. She stood too quickly, nearly knocking over the chair. The blanket he had used was folded into a careful square and placed on the seat. Beyond it, the diner door stood slightly open, unlocked. Cold air moved through the narrow gap. Mara stared at it, and for one sharp moment, every fear she had ignored returned at once. She had brought a stranger inside. She had allowed him near her son. She had handed him Wade's documents and given him permission to photograph every page. Maybe compassion had not made her brave. Maybe it had only made her careless. She turned toward Oren first. He was still asleep, safe. Then she hurried to the register. The $38 remained in the tray. The property agreement was still on the counter. Every page was there. The utility notice remained hidden where she had left it. Nothing was missing. That should have relieved her. Instead, disappointment settled deeper. Silas had simply gone. On the counter beside the sugar container, he had left 3 things. The first was the black funeral ribbon that had been tied to his motorcycle mirror. The second was the pair of wool socks Oren had given him. They had been washed in the small sink, wrung dry, and folded with unexpected care. Mara touched them with 2 fingers. Only hours earlier, Oren had offered those socks to a man he had been afraid to stand near. Silas had accepted them as though the gesture mattered. Now they were back. Beneath them lay a torn piece of paper. Mara unfolded it. "You fed a stranger. Give me until 9 to return the favor." She read the message twice. It did not make her hopeful. It made her angry. 9 o'clock was not a promise. It was Wade's deadline. A sentence written by a grieving man could not repair a furnace, settle a lien, or protect a building she was about to lose. Mara crossed to the window. The snowbank beside the road was empty. Silas's motorcycle was gone. She turned on the diner's old radio, needing any sound that was not the wind or her own doubt. Static filled the room. Then something low moved beneath it. At first, Mara thought the signal was breaking apart. But the sound grew deeper, steadier, closer. Somewhere beyond the diner, 1 engine became 3. 3 became 10. Their combined rumble rolled through the frozen valley, rising beneath the radio static like approaching weather. Not thunder, engines. At 5:48 that morning, a single headlight appeared through the snow. The motorcycle moved slowly along the frozen road and stopped outside Bellamy's last stop. Mara stood behind the diner window, one hand resting against the glass. The rider killed the engine, removed his helmet, and looked toward the building. He did not approach the door. A minute later, 3 more headlights emerged from the darkness. Then 6, then 20. The road began to fill with the low mechanical rumble of motorcycles arriving from both directions. Their beams swept across the snowbanks, the diner walls, and the faded sign above the entrance. Mara expected shouting. There was none. The riders moved with calm precision. Men and women wearing heavy jackets stepped into the road and began guiding motorcycles into rows. A few wore reflective vests over their patches. They pointed riders toward the abandoned repair lot, and the empty warehouse property beside the highway. Others placed reflective cones along the shoulder. One lane remained completely open. A tall rider stood near the intersection, waving traffic through and making sure no motorcycle blocked the route an ambulance or fire engine might need. Mara opened the diner door a few inches. Cold air rushed inside. The people arriving were carrying things: boxes of eggs, large cans of coffee, bags of flour, packages of bacon, portable griddles wrapped in canvas, toolboxes, lengths of pipe, electrical wire, furnace parts, lumber, and sealed containers of building supplies. Several riders held plain envelopes against their jackets to keep them dry. None of it made sense. Oren ran upstairs and pressed himself against the apartment window. 112, he called down. A few moments later, he started again because too many motorcycles were entering at once. 160, 100 and... He stopped counting. The engines grew louder, but the gathering remained orderly. Riders parked, removed their helmets, and waited. Some shook snow from their gloves. Others quietly carried supplies toward the diner without crossing the threshold. Still, Silas was nowhere among them. A patrol vehicle approached through the storm. The local deputy stepped out slowly, one hand near his radio, and studied the crowd. A road captain walked toward him with both hands visible. They spoke beside the cones while Mara watched from the doorway. The deputy looked down the clear emergency lane. He examined the parking rows. He spoke to several riders. Then he relaxed. No threats had been made. No road was blocked. No one had entered the diner without permission. The bikers were customers, volunteers, and people waiting for instructions. By 6:12, nearly 500 motorcycles had entered Briar Ridge. They stretched beyond the diner, past the frozen gas station, and around the bend where the highway disappeared beneath the falling snow. Black jackets stood shoulder to shoulder. Snow settled across helmets, handlebars, and glowing headlights. Mara's fear had not vanished, but disbelief was slowly giving way to something more dangerous: hope. Mara tightened the blanket around her shoulders and searched every face for Silas. She found strangers instead: riders with gray beards, women with snow on their braids, veterans, mechanics, and laborers. Each seemed to know why they had come. Only Mara remained outside the plan. Then a black luxury SUV appeared at the far end of the road. It moved carefully between the motorcycles. Wade Barlow had arrived. Wade's SUV stopped beside the diner. For several seconds, he remained behind the wheel, staring at the rows of motorcycles surrounding the property. Then he stepped out with the leather contract folder tucked beneath one arm. His polished shoes sank slightly into the snow. "What is this?" he demanded. No one answered. Wade looked toward the riders, then toward Mara standing in the diner doorway. "If this is an attempt to intimidate me, I will contact law enforcement." The deputy was already beside him. "You are looking at law enforcement." Wade turned. The deputy nodded toward the highway. "They are parked legally. Traffic is moving. The emergency lane is clear. No one has threatened you or anyone else." Wade looked across the crowd. "Then why are they here?" The deputy glanced toward the diner. "They say they are customers waiting for the business to open." The answer irritated Wade more than resistance would have. He crossed the snow toward Mara, holding the folder in front of him as though it settled everything by itself. "This changes nothing," he said. "The lien remains due at 9. Mara looked beyond him at the motorcycles stretching down the road. Wade followed her gaze. 500 people standing outside cannot alter a contract. His voice remained controlled, but the certainty had sharpened. He was speaking loudly enough for the nearest riders to hear. "A crowd does not erase debt. It does not repair violations. It does not extend a legal deadline." Mara wanted to believe the people around her meant the danger had passed. But Wade was right about one thing. The clock had not stopped. Then the first motorcycle engine died. A second followed, then another. The silence moved down the road in a wave until every engine had gone still. No rumble, no shouting, Only falling snow and the sound of Wade's breathing. The riders separated slowly, forming a path through the center of the crowd. A figure appeared at the far end. Silas walked toward the diner. His leather vest was dry now. Snow settled across his shoulders as he passed between the motorcycles. No one touched him. No one spoke. In his hands, he carried Mara's empty stew container, the same container that had held the last food in her kitchen. He stopped a few feet from Wade. Wade looked at the container, then at Silas. "If you think this gathering changes the agreement," Silas raised one hand. Wade stopped speaking. Silas did not move closer. He did not threaten him. His voice remained quiet. "You were right about one thing." He looked toward the contract folder. "A crowd cannot change a contract." Then he lifted the empty container slightly. "But a payment can." Silas kept the container closed for several seconds. The riders remained silent behind him. Mara looked from the container to the faces lining the road. She still did not understand what any of them expected from her. Silas turned toward the crowd. "Last night, I made a few calls." His voice carried through the stillness without becoming loud. "I told people exactly what happened, nothing more." He looked at Mara. "I told them a woman found me freezing beside the road." A pause followed. "That she brought me inside when every sensible reason told her not to." Mara lowered her eyes. Silas continued. "I told them she had almost no food left, but she divided it anyway. She fed her son. She fed a stranger. And she kept almost nothing for herself." Oren stood in the doorway behind Mara, listening. "I told them a man expected her to surrender the business her family built before morning." Wade's grip tightened around the folder. Silas did not look at him. "And I told them one more thing." He faced Mara again. She would not accept charity. Mara's expression changed. Silas nodded slowly. "So I did not ask anyone to donate." He placed the container on the hood of a parked motorcycle. "I asked them to buy something." A woman near the front raised a printed voucher. Then another rider raised one. Soon, hundreds of pieces of paper were visible throughout the crowd. "Prepaid meals," Silas said. "Purchased from Bellamy's last stop." Mara stared at the vouchers. Silas explained that some had been bought for future road trips. Riders who passed through Briar Ridge would stop at the diner and eat what they had already paid for. Others had purchased meals for local veterans. Some were designated for truck drivers stranded by storms. Dozens had been bought for families who could not afford a warm breakfast. More were reserved for firefighters, paramedics, snowplow crews, and first responders working through winter nights. The people gathered outside had not come merely to place money in Mara's hands and disappear. They had come as customers. They had purchased meals that would bring people back through her door for months, possibly years. Silas rested one hand on the container. Then he opened it. The bowl that had held Mara's final stew was no longer empty. Inside were stacks of signed meal vouchers, transaction records, and payment receipts. They filled the container to the rim. Mara stepped closer. She picked up one receipt, then another. Names covered the pages. Riders from nearby towns, clubs from other counties, independent bikers, veterans groups, mechanics, drivers, people she had never met. Every name represented a meal already sold. Every receipt represented money already committed to Bellamy's last stop. Mara tried to speak. Nothing came out. Silas lifted the container and placed it carefully into her hands. "You gave away your last meal." He waited until she looked at him. "We bought the next 5,000. Oren understood before Mara did. His face crumpled, and he began to cry. Mara held the container against her chest as the meaning finally reached her. The bowl she had carried from an empty kitchen now held the future of the diner. Not pity, not a handout, business, dignity, time. And for the first time since Wade delivered his deadline, Mara no longer felt alone. Wade looked at the vouchers and gave a dismissive laugh. "Those are promises for breakfast," he said. "They are not payment on a lien." A woman stepped out from the riders. Her name was Lenora Price. She was an attorney, a longtime motorcycle enthusiast, and the person Silas had called during the night. Lenora held a copy of the agreement Mara had allowed Silas to photograph. "I reviewed every page," she said. "The debt can be paid directly. Mara does not have to transfer the property to satisfy it." Wade's expression tightened. "That is not the arrangement I offered." "No," Lenora replied. "It is the option you failed to explain." The voucher campaign had generated verified funds. Riders had purchased meals in advance, and the payments were available immediately. Lenora confirmed the amount, submitted the transfer, and waited. No one shouted. No rider approached Wade. The deputy kept the road open while the crowd stood quietly in the snow. At 8:43 that morning, confirmation arrived. The lien had been paid in full. Bellamy's last stop still belonged to Mara. Lenora turned to Wade. "The photograph you took has been preserved. So has the message you sent afterward." She read the words back to him. "Sign tonight, and I will forget what I saw." Wade looked at Mara, the deputy, and hundreds of witnesses surrounding the diner. His strategy had depended on isolation, confusion, and a deadline. All three were gone. He closed the contract folder. No one threatened him. No one blocked his SUV. No one celebrated in his face. Wade walked back across the snow, started the engine, and drove away. Mara watched until the vehicle disappeared. Then she looked at the payment confirmation in her hands. The diner was hers, and this time, relief felt stronger than fear. Once Wade's SUV disappeared, the silence around Bellamy's last stop finally broke. Not with cheers, with work. Several riders moved toward the dead furnace, but only those with the right experience were allowed near it. A licensed heating technician opened the access panel, while an electrician checked the damaged connections. Outside, two carpenters examined the cracked steps leading to Mara's apartment and began replacing the weakest boards. No one treated the diner like a rescue project. They treated it like a business worth reopening. The first customers entered in small groups, brushing snow from their jackets and placing prepaid vouchers beside the register. Mara looked toward the empty refrigerator. "I can't feed all these people." A rider near the door smiled. "You don't have to." The boxes began coming inside. Eggs filled the counter. Bacon went into the refrigerator. Bags of flour were stacked beside the pantry. Coffee arrived in quantities Mara had not seen in years. Portable griddles were carried into the kitchen, along with fresh bread, butter, potatoes, and enough supplies to serve breakfast through the storm. Soon, coffee was brewing. Bacon hissed across the grill. Plates moved from hand to hand. Snow melted from jackets and formed small puddles beneath chairs. Orrin sat beside the register, carefully writing names across the first meal vouchers. Some were marked for veterans, others for first responders, truck drivers, or families who might need them later. Mara tied on her apron. For the first time that night, her hands stopped shaking. She returned to the grill. The diner slowly filled with conversation, warmth, and the familiar sound of people waiting to be fed. Silas took the same seat where he had eaten hours earlier. Mara placed a full bowl of stew in front of him. Not a divided portion, not what remained after everyone else had been served. A full bowl. She added 2 pieces of cornbread. Silas looked at them, then at her. Without speaking, he broke one piece in half and placed it beside Mara's bowl. The gesture was exactly the same as before. This time, Mara smiled. She sat across from him, and they ate together while the diner came back to life around them. Above the kitchen pass-through, her father's old sign remained in place. "Nobody leaves hungry." Mara had always believed the words were about food. That morning, she understood they meant something larger. No one should leave without dignity. No one should leave believing they were alone. And no act of kindness had to remain small. 1 year later, Bellamy's last stop was no longer fighting to survive. The diner was busy from sunrise through the afternoon. Mara had hired 2 other single parents, giving them work and flexible hours when their children needed them. Beside the register stood a suspended meal board. Customers could purchase breakfast for a stranger, a veteran, a truck driver, or anyone who entered hungry and unable to pay. Each winter, motorcycles returned to Briar Ridge for an event the town called the Last Meal Ride. The first prepaid voucher was framed beside Mara's father's wooden sign. Nobody leaves hungry. Silas came back every year for the ceremonial first breakfast. Beneath his boots, he still wore Oren's father's wool socks, repaired where they had stretched too far. Oren no longer hid when motorcycles approached. At the sound of engines, he ran outside to welcome them. Mara never became wealthy because she opened that door. Silas never erased every mistake hidden beneath his patch. Wade Barlow did not suddenly become a better man. But one winter night proved something Briar Ridge had forgotten. Cruelty often survives by making people feel alone. Kindness becomes powerful when it refuses to remain solitary. If you believe people should be judged by what they do, not by what they wear, subscribe to the channel. And if you believe no family should face people like Wade alone, comment, "Kindness rides together." Share this story with someone who still believes one act can bring an army of good people to the door. As motorcycles disappeared along the snowy road, Silas and Mara stood beneath the diner sign. Behind them, the first voucher remained framed. One meal, one decision, 500 answers.